Well, thank you both for that kind introduction. It's very good to be with you. Let me just start by reacting to the laundry list of problems facing Lebanon that you went through. I will not pretend in a 20 or 25-minute talk to solve all of these problems because I don't have a magic wand. I do, however, have some ideas that I think are necessary to stabilize things and provide a platform for fixing problems in Lebanon, because stability might not be everything, but everything is nothing without stability. And you certainly don't have stability right now. So what I'm going to talk about will be how do you attain stability, which would allow you then to start seriously addressing all the many problems that you listed, which are really quite incredible. Let me indicate that I will try to keep my remarks down to around 20 or 25 minutes, and then we can have a good session with questions and answers. Where I'm going to go is as follows. I will talk about central banking, a little historical overview of central banking and kind of a broad brush, which I think is important. I'll also talk briefly about central banking in Lebanon, and then I'll talk about some alternatives to central banking. My discussion of central banking will be, in fact, quite critical of central banking, and to stabilize things, the rules of the game have to be changed, and there have to be alternatives to what we call normal central banking. Now, so that's where I'm going, those 3 points. Central banking, a few remarks about Lebanon central banking, and then some alternatives that I think would be useful if implemented in Lebanon. Now, these subjects that I'm going to be talking about, there's subjects in which the ratio of evidence to theory is very low. People talk about these topics in very theoretical, hypothetical modes, making lots of conjectures that aren't based on any facts whatsoever. So I will stick to the facts, and as you indicated in the introduction, I actually have been involved in a number of successful currency reforms and banking reforms, so it will be something coming from a professor who actually has had a lot of real world experience. So I'm not going to be talking about theory that's presented on a blackboard. I'm going to be talking about things that I actually have done and experienced myself. Now, when we talk about a blackboard, by the way, much of what is dealt with in central banking is what Ronald Coase, the Nobel laureate in economics, literally called blackboard economics. You put your theory up on the blackboard, and it really doesn't have much to do with anything in the real world. It's kind of disconnected to the real world. And what's called the nirvana approach is often used in the discussions of central banking versus alternatives. And that is, the assumption is that central banking is working perfectly, just like it does on the blackboard, and all the other alternatives are flawed in some way, because the evidence, to the extent there is evidence presented, is out of the real world. And of course, in the real world, nothing works perfectly. So the nirvana approach is coupled often with blackboard economics, and as a result, the objections to the alternatives are, I think, either invalid, unimportant, or irrelevant. And what you end up with is what I call Hanke's 95% rule. 95% of what you read in the literature, even the so-called peer-reviewed literature, is either wrong or irrelevant. So so that's a little introduction. Let me make a few remarks about central banking, because most people actually aren't very familiar with central banking. It's actually quite a new institutional arrangement, central banking. In 1900, there were only 18 central banks in the world. In 1940, that number more than doubled. It was 40, and today there are 214 central banks. Of course, the Bank de Lebanon was established in 1963. So as you can see, that your central bank is in the new crop of central banks that have come really to a large extent after World War II. Now, what did we have before World War II, before this explosion in the number of central banks? We had either currency boards. There were about 70 jurisdictions that had currency boards, and a currency board is one in which a local currency is issued, and it has an exchange rate that's fixed to an anchor currency, and it's freely convertible at that fixed rate with the anchor currency, and the reserves backing the local currency are 100%. So the local currency really is just a clone of whatever the anchor happens to be. And most currency boards, by the way, around between World War I and World War II, were British. So the pound sterling was the anchor, and the local currencies that were issued were really just clones of pound sterling. There also was another alternative that was used, and that's what we now call dollarization. Some foreign currency was used in a territory or jurisdiction, but the local jurisdiction really had no local currency. So that would be something like, think of the Eurozone, for example. The Euro came into existence in 1999, and all the 27 countries now that are in the Eurozone are using the euro. They don't have a local currency. France no longer has the franc; it has the euro, and Germany has the Deutschmark, and so on. So those are the two big alternatives: just use of a foreign currency with no local currency, or a local currency was issued by a currency board and was just a clone of an anchor. So that's what existed prior, really, to World War II. Then we had World War II, and this explosion of central banks. And there were three factors that explain, in my view, why we had such an explosion of central banking. One is that John Maynard Keynes, of course, produced the general theory right prior to the war, and the idea was that most people grabbed onto, and it was very fashionable, that you could fine-tune the economy by either changing fiscal policy or changing monetary policy, changing those levers of fiscal and monetary policy. You could smooth out the business cycle, and so Keynesian economics was very fashionable. That was kind of the theory behind the need for a central bank. If you're going to fine-tune things and adjust the supply of money that's being emitted, you have to have a central bank, because a currency board, there is no discretionary monetary policy. And if you're using a foreign currency and don't have a local currency, you have no mechanism for discretionary monetary policy. So in both the alternative cases of currency boards or so-called dollarization, you had the inability to fine-tune and engage in discretionary fiscal and monetary policy. The second factor that gave rise to the central banking movement and the elimination of currency boards and dollarization was the fact that currency boards in particular were viewed as colonial institutions. And as countries became independent after World War II, they wanted to throw all the so-called colonial institutions overboard, out the window. So that was another factor. The third factor was we had the Bretton Woods Agreement and after World War II, and the Bretton Woods Agreement created two big institutions. One was the World Bank and the other was the International Monetary Fund. And those institutions had technocrats working there. And it was ideal to create jobs for the boys to create central banks. Because if you put a central bank in one of these former colonial countries that had become newly independent, the locals didn't know how to run the central bank. So they needed somebody from the IMF. They basically needed somebody from Washington, a technical person, to come and train them and teach them how to run the bank. So Keynesian economics, colonial institutions, and jobs for the boys at the World Bank and IMF were three factors that threw out what were the existing monetary arrangements at the time, largely, and throughout the world. And that's currency boards and dollarization. Now, it's interesting, another Nobel laureate, I mentioned Ronald Coase, another great Nobel laureate, Sir John Hicks. And Hicks, of course, was he was at Oxford. Before that, he was at London School of Economics, but he was a high priest of economic theory. And to quote him, he said that he wrote, on strict Ricardian principles, there should have been no need for central banks. And I agree with Hicks. We had very few central banks, and there really was no need for central banks in most countries. But as I said, now we have 214 of them, including the central bank in Lebanon, which is fairly new. I mean, 1963, it's not that old. But the central bank's performance in emerging market countries like Lebanon has been a complete disaster. Very poor performance, high and variable inflation rates, frequent currency crises, frequent banking crises, and the discretion that they have has allowed them to been great destabilizers. Remember, I said the main thing you have to have to move forward in an economy is stability, and central banks in emerging market countries have been tremendous destabilizers. They also, by the way, have fostered a tremendous, now in income inequality and equity. It's very fashionable to be talking about these matters now. Central banks have created a tremendous amount of inequality, because if you have high inflation, who is hurt the most? The people who have low incomes and the poor people. The rich, in fact, often benefit tremendously from high inflation. And the last thing I would mention is that, coupled with the poor performance of the central banks, we can't forget the IMF, because the IMF, remember I said, jobs for the boys. Central banks create jobs for the boys, and the firemen at the IMF have actually made things worse. If you look at where the IMF programs have come in, they've actually aggravated things. They've made things worse, not better. So that's a kind of an overview of central banks. Let me just go now to Lebanon for a few remarks. Vivian went through that laundry list of terrible things going on in Lebanon, and it reminds me of Hanke's schoolboy's theory of history is it's just one damn thing after another, and that's Lebanon. So if you look at the misery index that I calculate every year, the top four countries, the most miserable countries in the world, were in last year, 2022, Zimbabwe, and then Venezuela, then Syria, and then Lebanon. So Lebanon, out of 157 countries that I looked at in my misery index, Lebanon's pretty much at the bottom of the barrel with Zimbabwe, Venezuela, and Syria. The official inflation rate is right now 209% in Lebanon. I actually measured it today. I measure it every day accurately, and it's down at around 134%, which is terrible. I mean, it's a triple-digit inflation. The Lebanese pound has been kind of all over the place. From January 2022 until March of 23, it actually lost almost 81% of its value. Then since March, it's rallied and appreciated by around 57%. So it's been up, down, up, all over the place. And essentially, this wild volatility leads, it's a useless currency. You can't use it. Obviously, it's an unreliable store of value, but as a unit of account and unit of measure, you can't use it. It's just all over the place. As far as the economic performance, since 2018, Lebanon has been in a recession. I mean, negative growth. And the new October IMF World Economic Outlook, it doesn't even have a forecast for 2024. Things are so unstable that the IMF isn't even forecast. It's one of the few countries the IMF isn't even forecasting what they think the GDP course will be for 2024 or 2025. Now, if all that isn't bad enough, the central bank and government were involved in what was largely a huge Ponzi scheme, just outright theft. So this is pretty uncommon even for central banks. There's always the inflation tax. The inflation tax is a tax that no one votes on, but it is a tax, and it's a regressive tax. It hurts the poor much more than it hurts the rich. So that's one aspect of inflation. But this outright theft that you've experienced in Lebanon, you don't find that many places. The only other places actually that I have observed this recently are Argentina is one case. Argentina basically operates exactly like the Bank of Lebanon was operating, and Zimbabwe and some of these other cases, Venezuela, some of these basket cases do engage in something beyond the normal inflation tax, and that's just outright theft. So to summarize, what you've got institutionally in Lebanon is a flawed institution, the central bank, number one. So we should be looking at alternatives. But you also have something else. You have what I call fiscal and monetary anomie. And what that means is that no matter what the rules are in Lebanon, they just break the rules. You can have a law, but it's kind of irrelevant because the politicians just do whatever they want to do. So anomie is a big feature of the system. The system is flawed, and then you have culturally anomie going on, where people just they just don't pay attention to the law. They just break it. So let's look at the alternatives. and before I do that, let me just summarize. So when we look at the central bank, the real source of the problem and instability in Lebanon is the fact that the central bank has a lot of monetary discretion, and of course they've used it in the past. And two, Lebanon lacks what I call a hard budget constraint. They lack discipline on fiscal spending, and one reason they lack that is because the central bank loans money and extends credit. It isn't now with a new interim governor. They're not doing this, but historically they've extended credit to the fiscal authorities. So as a result, the fiscal authorities don't have a straitjacket around themselves. They don't have a hard budget constraint. They have what we call a soft budget constraint. So let's talk a bit about the alternatives. One alternative would be to simply do away with the Lebanese pound and adopt the U.S. dollar, maybe the euro, probably the U.S. dollar. I think is actually the preferred currency. But you could substitute a foreign currency for the local currency, and that would certainly give you a hard budget constraint because you would have no monetary institution at all. There'd be no way that a governmental entity, namely a central bank, could extend credit to the government. So you would have hard budget constraint, and that would solve the enemy problem too, because you wouldn't even have a law that govern monetary matters or exchange rate matters. You just have a foreign currency, and that would be it. There are 33 countries around the world that do this. One happens to be Montenegro, which I dollarized in 1999. We got rid of the hyperinflating Yugoslav dinar and made the Deutschmark, at that time, 1999, legal tender. Then I was involved in Ecuador in 2001 when they dollarized. Both Montenegro and Ecuador, I was actually an official. Unofficially, I was involved in helping Zimbabwe dollarize from 2009 to 2014. So that's one possibility. And it's fairly easy to understand. And by the way, there's a big debate now. Next Sunday, there'll be an election in Argentina, and one of the candidates for presidency, Javier Milei, is proposed to get rid of the central bank in Argentina and the peso and replace it with the US dollar. The other option is this currency board option, and I've been involved in establishing those in Estonia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, and Bosnia. And all of those cases, they were installed in different circumstances, but they all established stability. And as I said, stability might not be everything, but everything's nothing without stability. Now, so those are two alternatives. The nuance in Lebanon, and something that I find interesting, is you could retain the central bank, but change the central bank law and change it in a way that's more or less roughly consistent with the way the interim governor of the central bank is actually operating the central bank in Lebanon, and that at present. And that is, you would set up an issue department, and the issue department would be responsible for issuing the Lebanese pound, and the Lebanese pound would be backed 100% with foreign reserves, and the Lebanese pound would trade at a fixed exchange rate with the anchor currency, the reserve currency. So the issue department within the bank would actually be a currency board. And that's what, in all these cases, Estonia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, and Bosnia, that's what I actually did. They actually have central banks. The Bulgarian National Bank is a central bank, but it's organized as the Bank of England originally was when it was formed. It has an issue department that in fact is a currency board, and a banking department. And the banking department takes care of regulating banks, and then you have also you would have a research department that was in charge of doing research and collecting statistics, things like that. So that would be, I think, an attractive option for Lebanon, in the sense that to some extent the bank now is actually operating de facto in that way, generally, not exactly, but generally. So that would be one thing. Now the other thing that is a problem, of course. Vivian alluded to this earlier when she said, well, what about the old Lebanese pounds that are all captured at banks and subject to what de facto are capital controls? You can't take your money, all of your money out of the bank. So I would suggest that you think about having a parallel currency system where the new Lebanese pound was issued by the central bank in an issue department, and the issue department was in fact a currency board. So the new Lebanese pound would be a clone of the anchor, let's say the U.S. dollar. So that's the new pound, and the old pound, that would circulate alongside the new pound, but and you would remove the capital controls. And my conjecture is that old pound would wither away and disappear actually fairly rapidly. This is in fact what we did really in Montenegro, because what we did, remember, Montenegro is part of the rump Yugoslavia in 1999. It wasn't an independent country. It was part of Yugoslavia. And the money that was used in Serbia and Montenegro, it was Yugoslav dinar. And that was legal tender. And to dollarize the country, we simply made the German mark legal tender. And once we did that, the old Yugoslav dinars just disappeared from circulation in a matter of weeks. They were gone. So I'm not saying that it would be that fast in Lebanon, but it probably would be fairly fast. Now these parallel currency systems, of course, exist. Almost all the emerging market countries have them de facto, because there's spontaneous dollarization that goes on. The second largest stock of U.S. dollar notes that exist in the world, they're in Argentina. 265 billion dollars of U.S. dollar notes exist under the mattress and in safe deposit boxes in Argentina. So that's an informal form of parallel currencies that exists almost every emerging market country. I'm talking about formally doing it, and formally we have it in Peru, because Peru actually has two legal tenders. The Peruvian local currency and the U.S. dollar are both legal tender in Peru. And you've had it in the past, and in Russia they've had parallel currencies at various times. In 1918 to 1920, there was a North Russian currency board, and that North Russian ruble circulated in parallel along with a regular ruble, and of course the currency board ruble was superior, and it drove the Russian ruble out of existence. And then you had another currency reform with parallel currency, both issued by the Central Bank of Russia, and from 1920 until 1922. So these parallel currency things have existed, And ultimately, what you end up with is that the superior currency drives out the inferior currency. And I would argue, obviously, the inferior currency in Lebanon would be the old Lebanese pound. But if you had the parallel currency system, you could at least untrap those, those old Lebanese pounds from the banking system. So with that, I've used up almost 30 minutes of time, a little longer than I wanted to. And that's really my summary of things. I should end with one note, by the way, that on this hard budget constraint. Since you have fiscal and monetary enemy in Lebanon, I think you should also, to really ensure stability, have a fiscal rule in which a supermajority vote in the parliament was required. If the country was going to increase its debt, there would have to be a vote of 2/3 of the parliament to approve the increase in the debt. Or if there was a new tax or change in the tax base of any old tax, there would also have to be a supermajority vote in the parliament of 2/3 or more to pass it. So that would constrain the fiscal mischievousness, let's say, that visits Lebanon or has visited in the past. So with that, I will stop